Hi, I'm Seán Duggan, and this is TheFIX, a podcast about Photoshop, Lightroom, post-processing, and the cool and creative things we get to do with our images after the shoot. On this week's show, my guest is Fran Forman, a digital artist who creates surreal and beautifully enigmatic photographic composites. As a compositing artist myself, I've admired her work for many years, and I'm really looking forward to talking with her about her images, inspiration, and her creative process. Stay with us. Well, I'd like to welcome my guest, Fran Forman, to TheFIX. Fran, thank you so much for taking the time to join me this morning.
I am delighted. I'm delighted to meet you finally, Seán. I've heard about you for a long time.
Oh, well, and I have admired your work for a long time. It's got a beautiful lyrical style to it that has long appealed to me. So, just out of curiosity, how long have you been doing compositing using Photoshop as your primary tool to create those?
Well, prior to the creation of Photoshop, I did compositing the old-fashioned way with glue and paper and scissors. But in 1992, I was introduced to Photoshop. I had been working as a graphic designer for many years and had taken off about 4 years to have my kids. And when they were old enough to go to school and I was completely bored and needing to go back to work, I realized that I was kind of out of date because between 1986 and 1989 or 1990, everything had changed in terms of technology. So I signed up for a 2-month class at Harvard, and it was a class in multimedia, and one of the applications that we were taught was Photoshop. So that was 1992, before there were layers, and I just fell in love with it. I mean, it was just made for me, or at least that's how I felt. And I loved it and worked so hard. I ended up teaching it at Harvard for a while. So it was really love at first sight. But before there were layers in Photoshop, there was an application called Painter. And Painter had 2 layers available. They were RIF formats, I think. And so I could work in Photoshop, do save as's, bring them over, bring my document over to Painter, create 2 whole layers in Painter, and then bring those back to Photoshop and just do multiple save as's. So that's how I got started, actually.
That's kind of like, it was probably heady stuff, having 2 whole layers.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Really? Right. This is antique Photoshop. So that's how I got started.
It sounds like you and I got started in Photoshop at about the same time, actually, because I started at that time as well. I started in version 2, I think, before there were layers.
Yes.
And I remember what a great revelation it was when layers first showed up in Photoshop 3. It certainly made things a lot easier because
it really did. It was amazing. It was sort of mind-blowing, and it was the kind of thing you always wanted to do but couldn't really figure out how to do otherwise. So yeah, it's a good thing that I learned early, because if I had to dive in and try to figure it out now, I'm not sure I would have bothered. It's just good to have grown up with it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to phrase it, and I'm glad that I grew up with it, because it obviously makes it easier to sort of absorb the changes that come down with each version, having known it since the early 1990s.
Absolutely.
But like you, I did some kind of old school analog compositing, kind of more pasting photos together.
Yep.
And then also did, compositing in the black and white darkroom, kind of, a la the way Jerry Uelsman would do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But unlike Jerry Uelsman, I never had, multiple enlargers next to each other. I would just had the one enlarger, which made it a lot more challenging.
Certainly. More problems with exposure, that's for sure.
And so, your images have this just really beautiful, fantastical feel to them. And I'm just wondering, when you are going through your creative process in terms of, coming up with ideas for your images and, maybe some of the stories behind them, where do you find inspiration? Kind of what sets you off? Is it the idea first, or do certain images suggest ideas to you?
It's really more the latter. I find I spend a lot of time looking at images, taking images, scanning old photographs, but also taking a lot of landscape images. And I work on an image independent of other images. It's not as if I'm working on a series. So I'm really sort of a slave to my emotions at the time that I'm working on it. So there will have to be something that inspires me about a landscape, an object, a person, an animal, and I'll just start playing around with that, not really knowing where it's going to go. I mean, there are some artists who do this kind of work who are much more maybe meticulous or are able to plan ahead of time and work out ahead of time what they want to do. But my work is more akin, I would like to say, to a jazz musician or an abstract expressionist. So I'm really playing one object or one image against another, and then just seeing how they combine. So it's like I have a blank stage and I start moving things around to see how they work on that stage. It's almost like a choreographer in a way, the way a choreographer works. It's not thought out, and I'm very dependent on my emotional state at the time that I'm working on it. So things will shift during the days or weeks that I'm working on an image, just depending on how I'm feeling, or maybe even the music I'm listening to, or something that's happening in the world that affects me.
Right. So it really is more like, as you mentioned, you referenced jazz and jazz improvisation, things like that. There is this sort of strong element of improvisation to the creative process.
There's a lot of serendipity that happens when you start playing with images, especially when you combine one image to another, especially working in the layers palette and just seeing how they affect each other. So I try to take advantage of it's really serendipity, and it's very unlikely that I'll be able to anticipate precisely what it's going to look like beforehand. So I take advantage of those relationships and try to work with them. But it's also dependent on having spent a lot of time in the arts and thinking about what makes an image strong, thinking about the edges of an image, every pixel needing to be relevant to the image. So it's not just a complete accident. I don't want to suggest that.
Julianne Cost, of course, who has been, Adobe's, chief graphic arts and photography and imaging evangelist for many years, who does some wonderful composites herself. She has this great saying that I've heard her share with people at seminars and stuff, which really pertains to compositing in Photoshop, I think, so perfectly. She says, "Photoshop without an idea is like a monkey with a loaded gun."
That's really true. That's perfect.
Yeah, in Photoshop, it is so easy to just sort of, when you're learning to do compositing in Photoshop, just putting images together and just sort of, randomly putting stuff together. And it can be technically very good. But again, I think the idea and the story underlying that really is important to kind of give it a good foundation to make it work as more of a story image, or an image that conveys an idea or a concept.
Well, having had a background in graphic design and also in art history before I started delving into Photoshop and creating my visual narratives was actually helpful, because from graphic design, I learned the importance of communicating an idea visually, especially in a small, compact way, because you have to hit your client very quickly. But also, graphic design is an intersection of psychology and fine art, as well as commerce. So that was something that really helped me. But also, having studied art history for a long time beforehand. You just, and I have to really continue paying attention constantly to what's going on in the art world. And I love it. And I look at pictures so much of the day. It's ridiculous, but it gives me inspiration, and something might play off of something that I've seen. And I spend way too much time just following threads on the internet, just looking at other people's work and seeing what else is going on and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And there's also, when I teach this, I do teach technique, but I'm really much more interested in the vision rather than the technique. Obviously, the craftsmanship has to be good enough so that it doesn't destroy the image or it doesn't interfere with the message that you're trying to suggest. But it's really more about the message. It's about the evocation of the message.
Yeah. Do you? Actually, I had a question for you about how you use color in your work. But let's actually look at some of your images and talk about them, and then I can pop that question in if it makes sense. So why don't you go ahead and share your screen, and we'll dive into that.
So, Seán, I'm showing you some images that I've worked on over the past month or two. I took a little trip to Alabama recently. I wanted to kind of retrace the march from Selma to Montgomery. I actually was on that march in 1965.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm really that old. But anyway, it was very inspiring in some ways and really discouraging in many other ways. So rather than go into that, I can just show you just a few images. This is one composite that came from that recent trip, which was shot in January. This particular building and the river was in Selma, Alabama, and the sign on the building that says Alabama Wholesale actually was from a different source. And everything else is composited, including the birds, the woman, the windows, the lighting, and the clouds. But it is something that I wanted to give a suggestion of loss and a little bit of escape. Okay, this image also came from that same trip to Selma, Alabama. It is a composite, but much of the background was actually a photograph that I took. It was late in the day. The reflections on the windows were really striking, and on the building were striking. But obviously, I enhanced it, added quite a bit of color to it, and inserted the woman. And I have to say, I showed this to someone, and they complimented me on how clever I was to have the woman's arms move in the same direction as the branches of the tree. But in fact, that was completely an accident. I was not aware of it until afterwards. That's something that I see as well, and that was one of the first things that I saw. I would love to take credit. Maybe in some deep level I understood that what I was doing, but I have to say I think it was a happy accident. But so that worked out well. I had an earlier figure in that spot, and I had taken that figure out. So maybe on some level I just sort of intuited it. I'm not sure. I can't really suggest that I'm taking credit for it. But the reflections in the windows, and as I said, the coloration, that was all added to the original photograph. So this one is called Selma Light. I was very, very fortunate in that I had a solo exhibition at the Fox Talbot Museum, which just closed in January. It was up for about 6 months. And I was able to get over there in October for the artist reception. When I came, and I took obviously a million photographs. In the background, you'll see Laycock Abbey, which was the original home of Fox Talbot. And I saw that Keith Carter had done a photograph called The Birth of Photography, in which he also shot Laycock Abbey, but he had a sheep in front of it. So this is just a play on Keith's work. I was just going to interject there for viewers and listeners who are unfamiliar with this. That's a reference to William Henry Fox Talbot. Yes.
One of the very first practitioners of photography in England in the mid-1800s.
Actually, 1839. And the English would not say he is one of the founders. They would say he is the founder. So there's,
right. And of course, the French have another story.
Yes, they certainly do. But because I was in England, I go with their side. So this is a composite I worked on in January, actually, and it's called Dreaming of Siena, only because the background, the textured background, was a shot that I had taken when I was in Siena, probably 10 or 12 years ago. But it's obviously composited. The motivation for this was not the photograph of Siena or the girl or the glasses or the smoke, but it was a photograph I took of the concrete walls at the Louis Kahn Design Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth, Texas. And I just found the shadows and the texture of the walls really stunning. And if you look very closely, you can actually see some of the dots that are embedded into the concrete. But I started with that and just kind of let it flow. This is really more of an abstract painting than a sort of traditional photograph.
I think that for some types of compositing, I think that there definitely is a lot in common with painting, or at least the creative process that some painters experience, because there is this sort of building up of texture and color and layering texture and color and, of course, images to arrive at a path or a story in the image.
I feel that very strongly. And this went through many, many iterations, but what was most important to me was maintaining the texture and the shades and the patterns and the geometry of the space. Mm-hmm. It's almost go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you find that when you're working on projects, and this actually is kind of cycling back to the question that I was going to ask about color earlier on, but do you find that certain projects develop a kind of a color palette that is visible throughout, the entire project across many different images, or is your color palette just sort of more based on, what works for that individual image?
It's really the latter. The color that I work with is dependent on the image and the ways the objects and the pieces of the image actually work together. So I don't work on a series or a project. I find that there's certain colors that I gravitate towards, such as warm tones, as you can see here. But again, it depends. I mean, it's really about a relationship of objects and other colors, one color to another. So I play a lot with just how those colors really communicate with one another. I think that's the best way to say it. But that's, as I said, that's dependent more on the object, on the image and the objects within the image.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier something that I found intriguing, just because it kind of resonated with me personally in terms of how I work on a lot of my own composites. You said that you essentially treat each image almost as a standalone thing. You're not really necessarily pursuing a larger narrative arc or story or theme when you are working on composites. Each one is kind of its own standalone thing. Is that pretty consistent with the way you've worked?
Yes, that is entirely true. Yes. Even if I try to work on a series, I end up kind of losing consciousness when I'm working on another image, and it moves into its own direction. It's really not necessarily consistent with what I might have had in mind. So in some ways, I kind of get in trouble with more traditional photographers, because many people I know do tend to work in series, and they have an idea that they want to work with. And as hard as I try to do that, I just kind of almost lose myself in the individual image, and it ends up being very different than the way that I might have anticipated it or might have wanted it to go.
Well, that's really interesting to me because so far in my own compositing work, I have not, structured them together in any sort of a series for that very reason, because I've sort of tended to work on each image more or less on its own, and I think for a long time I was hoping to find some thread of a theme or a concept that would bind them all together into a quote unquote series. And I sort of haven't found that. And so I've kind of, in a way, struggled with that creatively. But I'm actually glad to hear that you work that way. It gives me hope, thinking, well, maybe I'm thinking about this all wrong, and I'm trying to artificially impose the construct of a series on something that really doesn't necessarily need to have it.
Well, I think you're right. And it is an imposition that's been that you and I have been bombarded with by more traditional photographers, or the history of photography, where people do tend to work in a documentary way on a series. But when you're working on an individual image, as you are, as I am, you just let the image speak for itself. And I think that's great. Actually, it's reaffirming to know that you have a similar way of working. It would be easier for you or for me to work on a series at one time. For one thing, we could always make sure that we have the same proportions, the same size. It would be easier to print the damn things. But you're paying more attention to the image, which I am too. And I think that's valid. I think, just think of yourself more as a painter. They don't work in series. They work on a painting one at a time.
Well, and of course, eventually, images are sort of collected together into, some sort of a grouping just to show them. You have groupings of different portfolios on your website, and you've chosen to group images together under a specific title, or maybe that's just the images you are working on during a specific period in time. And of course, photography lends itself quite naturally to working in series. And I do work in series in some of my other types of photographic work, but so far I have found that to be elusive in my compositing work, although there is a kind of a loose idea that would bind them all together.
Well, compositing is really closer to painting than it is to photography, I think. I mean, you and I, in terms of our compositing, we're using photographic elements to create a painting. And I think we need to somehow expand the definition of photography or of painting to be able to understand that. Clearly, when you work on images or when I work on images, it's all coming out of your head and hand and mind. And when I'm working on it, my mind is still here, and there are certain emotional components that are consistent throughout all of my work. But it's only after I finish working on an image or a series of image that I'm able to step back and see what the relationships are from one image to another, and also what it was I was trying to say. And I see, over the past 6 months, I see my work shifting quite a bit and really dealing more with issues of mortality, more existential questions. My work is a little bit more somber, but maybe there's an aspect of hope and optimism in it too, because of things that have been going on in my life and in the world in general. But I only see that after having finished working on an image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that sort of that mirroring effect that art can have, where after completing the work or a series of works, an artist looks back at them and actually sees reflections of themselves or concerns that they have that may not have been conscious in their mind when they were making the work. Yeah,
that's absolutely true. That's true.
Before we move on from this one image, I just have a question about your use of models in the shot. Do you find that you use pictures of just people you find out about in the world, or are you actually, for some pictures, such as this one of the woman there, are you actually working with a model to have them adopt certain poses that are going to work to advance the story of the composite?
No, in this case, no, I don't, because I don't really know where I'm going to use these models or where they're going to go eventually. Mm-hmm. So this was a young woman that I photographed in November in Los Angeles, and lovely teenager. And I had her do a lot of poses for me, but at the time I wasn't sure where I was going to use them. I just knew that there were certain poses that I tend to gravitate towards in making my composites. So she was actually shot in the backyard of a building in LA before I knew where she was going to go. And so again, it's almost like I have folders of people and models and photographs of people that I've shot in the past. And when I'm not feeling terribly creative and I'm not doing much of anything, I'll silhouette them and cut them away from the background, which is about, as you know, the most tedious, painstaking thing in the world. It's absolutely distasteful, but it's a good thing to have done, because when I'm ready and when the creative muses are flowing, then I can start grabbing some of those images that I've cut away from the background and just try them out in different settings.
It's like a chef kind of preparing some of the ingredients ahead of time.
That's right. Yeah, this is my broccoli that's already been prepared.
There you go.
Right. Okay, should I go on with another one?
Yeah, let's look at another one.
This is an older image. I did this 3 years ago, but I made some changes to it over the last couple months. It's actually not completed. This is an earlier version. The very first version was this composite, but there was an iguana at the bottom of the steps, which I don't have here to show you. And then I worked on this one. I took away the iguana, kept this. And the final image, which I'm sorry I can't locate at the moment, actually has a cat at the very top of the stairs. But at any rate, this is a composite. The background was shot in a very dark setting in Oaxaca, Mexico, but the lighting was beautiful. And I added a lot of features to this, including the checkered floor, the candle, the child, which actually is a scan of an old photograph I had of my father when he was probably 4 years old in the 1920s. And then I photographed the string, the leash, and the girl at the very top of the stairs. So this is a composite that I'm still working on. It's still almost completed, but probably not completely completed. But what's you had asked me earlier where I get my images from. I'm quite inspired by various different trips that I take, and Oaxaca was one of those places that I just found just filled with wonderful colors and inspiring landscapes and buildings, mostly interiors of buildings.
Yeah. There are definitely certain places that speak to us and can initiate entire new bodies of work just because they are so rich in terms of their color or texture or form or what they suggest to us.
It's true. And maybe I'm living in a place in which those things exist here, but I'm not aware of it, so I need to go on a trip. Okay, here's a very recent picture.
All right, yeah, I saw that one recently, yeah.
So this was just completed, and I started working on this just because I was interested in the color of the sky. The sky that you're looking at in this image is actually 4 or 5 different skies, including a sunset that I shot out of Key West. But the clouds were from many, many different sources. I have a huge folder of cloud photographs that I've taken. And the sea is also a composite of many different images from the sea, which I've created in a more painterly way, I suppose. The girl was that same model that I used in an earlier picture. Mm-hmm. The cheetah, actually, I shot that cheetah with the camera in 1995 when I went on a trip to Kenya. And the cheetah was shot with film, obviously, and was kind of far away. I wasn't that close to it, but somehow it seems to work pretty well here. And the bird over in the corner, and the bird in the bird cage were taxidermied animals. Mm-hmm. The hardest part about creating this was shooting the bird cage and then cutting out all the spaces between the slats in the bird cage. Which was really, really difficult to do. Just so annoying and painstaking. But I used a lot of bird cages. The ribbon was a ribbon that I shot too, and by using I think I used a transparency in order to have this, and worked it as well, and luminosity in order to show the girl and the girl's clothes from behind the ribbon. I got a sense of transparency.
Yeah.
The hat was added later. The glasses were added later. So this is a composite of probably, I don't know, maybe 20 different pieces.
And so when you're working on something like this, is there a certain idea behind this image, or is the image really just sort of leading you along?
This image was leading me along. As I said, I started with the background with the sea and the sky. I just thought it was beautiful. And I wanted to use this woman because I loved her pose. She just looks kind of haughty and strong. I just thought she was great and made her really the centerpiece of the image. I'm not sure. I mean, I can't really explain what I was thinking when I was making it, but it held together in a way. There were many other elements in this image before I completed it, but one by one, I took them out. For example, at one point, I had a cityscape in the background, and it just seemed unnecessary. So the more that I've been working on composites, the more simplifying I think I'm getting with my imagery. And here also the other part of it, because the landscape, I think the sky is just so strong. I wanted a centerpiece, which was the girl, and I wanted to make sure that the viewer looks at the sky and at the water as much as the girls. So she's just she has no color. She has very little color. The only color is actually in her glasses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. Do you find that people will approach you maybe at a gallery opening or maybe contact you, via email or whatever, and tell you interpretations that they have seen in
Absolutely.
your images?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. And it's almost like a Rorschach test for people, which is fantastic. Yeah. And so, I mean, quite often they'll say, well, what were you intending? What were you thinking when you made this? And the fact is, I don't like to reveal what was in my mind. I think it's more important and more interesting for other people to come up with their same interpretations, which they're happy to do. And one of my favorite things to do is to just be a fly on the wall and hear people talk about among themselves what they see, and they'll tell stories. At a gallery opening a couple years ago in Durango, there was a boy, maybe 12, and his grandmother, and they were looking really intently at every single picture, and they were discussing what they saw, and it just made me so happy. And I don't know what they were saying, but they were clearly making up stories. So it was just a wonderful experience for me to see, these different generations communicate between themselves about my pictures and what it meant to them and the stories that they developed as a result of looking at the pictures.
Yeah, I've always felt that or viewed photographs, and perhaps some photographs more than others, but essentially viewed photographs, and actually this could be applied to really any work of art, as an invitation for the viewer to kind of step into it and see what they can find, or pick up a thread and follow that thread and see where it leads them personally.
That's a wonderful way to explain it, that it's an invitation. I love that.
Yeah.
That's perfect. That's exactly what I think.
So do you give hints in the titles of your pieces, or are your titles just sort of more descriptive of the scene?
I am the worst person in terms of titling my work. So I just give them titles only because I need to identify them. So for example, the one that's up on the screen now is called Glider or Hang Glider over Laycock, which is a stupid title, but it tells me what it is. So they're really identifiers rather than hints. Mm-hmm. Let me just say something about this one. This was also shot in Laycock, near the Laycock Abbey, and the little chapel was right behind the Abbey. The hang glider was shot from the Science Museum in London before I got to Laycock, and the coyote was from a taxidermy shop in Vermont. And the grass and the trees and the clouds are from many different sources. So it's a fairly simple picture, but it comes from lots of different places. But in terms of title, no, I don't have a very clever title at all, I'm sorry to say. If you have any ideas, let me know.
Well, I kind of go back and forth. I mean, I like the idea of using titles to maybe suggest a hint to the viewer of perhaps what's in my mind or what I see in the image. But I totally see the view that some people have that well, you should just put it up and let the viewer not interfere with the viewer's own experience and what they find in the image.
Well, this one that's up, this does have a title that might do exactly that. This is called Melancholic Museum. But that's about as much as I'm giving away. And from there, the viewer is going to have to make their own determinations. This is also composited. Initially, the background was shot in Oaxaca at an empty museum, but the artwork on the walls that you see are from various different other sources. So this is probably, I don't know, another 20 to 50 layers of different images.
So, that actually brings up a good question that I get asked a lot by people when they look at, composites that I do, and I'm sure you get asked the same question. Common thing that people ask is, how long did it take you to do that? and what I find is that, with compositing, it's not so much that the technical steps, how long it took me to technically put it together. It's really just sort of discovering the image as I make it, and that's what takes the time. It's not that it took a certain amount of time to make a layer mask or colorize something or whatever. It's just the process of finding the image, letting the image lead me on so that I can discover what the image is about. That's what takes the time, which can be, anywhere from, a few hours to several weeks or months.
Absolutely. That's really true. I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that's been my experience too. And also, because the digital ink is never dry, you don't necessarily stop at a certain point. You keep going back and kind of futzing with it and making changes and improving it in one way or another, or maybe ruining it. But you're right. It just takes a long time. I mean, just slapping one image onto another doesn't take all that long, especially, using masking and stuff. But it's really the relationship of the images. You're constantly having to try one against another and seeing where they were. In fact, this image, an earlier version of this image had the shadow of the soldier in the background at a place that I felt was incorrect. And after having printed it and sat on it for weeks and weeks and weeks, I went back and I fixed the shadow. So I think this is the one with the proper shadow. But you're right. It takes a very long time to kind of pull all the pieces together. Yeah. And I don't know how you know when to stop. People ask me that all the time. How do you know when it's done? So my answer would be either I can't think of anything else to make it better, or I'm so sick of it that I don't want to look at it anymore. Those are the two stopping.
Yeah. I once heard or read a quote that is attributed to Pablo Picasso, and I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, but it is perfect. I probably should do some research to see if this is really something that he is supposed to have said. But people asked him, interviewers or whatever, well, how do you know when you're done with a painting? Because some of his later work was a lot more abstract and stuff like that. And he said, how do you know when you're done with a painting? And he's reputed to have said, when they take it away from me.
That's right. Well, he was lucky in that he had galleries who were able to sell them right away. He didn't even have to work hard at that.
Yeah, they probably said, hey, Pablo, we got to do this show, so give us the paintings.
Right. So this is an image that I actually completed last week. Again, you'll notice the bird cage, that I had to cut out all the slats of the bird cage. This was that same girl that I photographed in Los Angeles. The woman in the background holding the camera was from an old photograph. People seem to love giving me old photographs that they find in their attics that they feel too guilty throwing away. So I just have piles of people's old snapshots and stuff. And that's what this one is. I don't know who that woman was. Similarly for the figure in the canoe in the background. Yeah. But again, the landscape, the marsh and the water was created from many, many different landscapes. The grass was actually part of a marsh that I shot in Cape Cod. And the water, the clouds, the rocks just come from other sources.
Interesting. So I'm sure that you have a personal lexicon of symbols that show up again and again in your work.
Yeah, it's, I guess you could call it my vocabulary, or it's part of my language. And you'll see I use a lot of birds, bird cages, mostly women. I tend to shoot lighthouses, which you see here. I've used in many, many different images that I've worked on. And sometimes I'll cannibalize one picture and take pieces and parts of it and use it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. I love the color in that one. This
one is very, very poorly titled. If you had a better title, I just call it Caravan because that
works for me.
Because I have no imagination. So this is called Caravan. The lighthouse was shot in September on Cape Cod. It's the Highland Lighthouse, and the Caravan. The camels actually were from an old photograph. I think they're from the late 19th century that I got a hold of and scanned. And the rest of it is just painted. I mean, it's painted digitally. It's all digital painting.
Yeah, nice. It almost looks like the clouds, the way the clouds kind of blend into the colors. It almost looks like very much like a painting, like a watercolor painting, because the way watercolor kind of bleeds into the different colors, Yeah,
I think of my work, as I said, really more of almost painting. Here's another recent one. The biplane was also shot in the Science Museum in London when I was there in October. And again, this background, the marsh was shot, this part of the marsh was shot on Cape Cod, and the stream comes from a completely different source. So I added that to the marsh, and the background imagery, the clouds, and what appears to be the waves of the sea, many, many different sources, lots of clouds, and the figures were two models. I added the goggles onto the girl in the foreground, and I also gave her a little diaphanous skirt. She was wearing blue jeans, which I think is appropriate. So yeah. Gave her a skirt. I don't have a good title for this. It's called Running Girls with Biplanes, but that's only because I just finished it and I haven't thought of a better title, although maybe I'll just keep that. This is called Running in Glen Arm, and the composite, the background, are many, many different scenes that I shot in Ireland and England this past fall. And again, I'm really more here playing with color and light and texture.
Although, there's the similar motif of the girl, running away. We saw that, of course, in the previous one you showed us. So
right, it's the same girl. Right, same girl. This was just a very simple courtyard that I shot in Mexico about 2 years ago. What I loved about it was the way the light was falling, the shapes and the geometry and simplicity of it. So I added some blue to see what would happen. This girl, you'll see, I used her. Now I changed the colors, masked out the blue that was on the opposite wall, added the girl and the bird cage, changed the face of the girl, and I started playing around with other objects to see if it works. So I have a shadow of the bird cage and the shadow of a bird, which is so surreal, and a clock that's horizontal. By the way, this was the painting that I used for the girl's face.
Oh, interesting.
So here I got rid of the shadow and the bird because I just thought it was too cliched. I raised the clock above the ground, adding a shadow underneath the clock, but still wasn't completely satisfied. I added an iguana, and this was the final image. So this is the earlier one, and I just brightened quite a bit of it. So this is the final one.
Yeah, the color contrast between the two sides of the wall and also the window up above was really striking in that one.
Yeah, these are complementary colors that really work well. And I also added a texture just to slightly darken the yellow, the brightness of the yellow. So this, let me just show you the very first one was this. And this is where I ended up.
Whenever I see a wall like that or anything like that, the one thing that comes to my mind in terms of compositing is that, oh, what a beautiful blank stage that is, or a blank canvas.
Exactly. I was an artist in resident last year in Key West, and I thought, well, this is going to be inspiring. I'm going to take lots of pictures and use them in my composites. But in fact, it was so lush and there was so much foliage everywhere that I ended up using nothing. I just relished the emptiness of the space. That's why I think I'm gravitated towards marshes or glacial spots. I'm going to Iceland and Norway for a residency this summer, and I think that will provide me with a lot of work, a lot of images to work with.
Yeah, Iceland is very inspiring because just the landscapes are so grand and epic, and also they provide a beautiful stage because there are very few trees and forests in Iceland. So you just have the sort of the bare landforms and these magnificent skies. So you'll love that.
Oh, yeah. And also being in Norway on the fjords should be pretty interesting. I can just go through this this image is called The Traveler. And if you want, I could just zip through here pretty quickly. Yeah. Okay. This was the background that I created. The wall was from a museum, the concrete wall of a museum, but I painted in the rest of it that you see. Added clouds, more clouds, clouds over the wall, clouds on the floor. Boy, this is a megaphone. Mm-hmm. But then I added a handle, created the handle in the shadow, more shadow, highlight, shadow behind the megaphone, more shadow, shadow over him, more shadow, shadow behind him. Gave him a hat, shadow underneath the hat, more shadow. Gave him a suitcase, painted this background, took a photograph of a rainbow, masked out the rest, another bird cage. He's holding the bird cage, the rainbow, and the landscape is behind him. This is a picture of me and my brother, which I put into his bird cage.
Oh, yeah, there they are.
This is me, which I put into the background on the marsh. Give it a little bit more saturation.
I love how the colors in the sky, especially around the rainbow, really echo some of the color in the whatever that megaphone or bugle that he's got there.
It's a megaphone, and also the bird cage. I also wanted to highlight the bird cage.
Yeah, that's nice.
And one more if you want. This is pretty fast. This was Laycock Abbey, where our friend William Henry Fox Talbot lived. That's there. All right. This picture, but then added clouds, blurred, added another layer, unblurred, but changed my layer to soft light. Added texture, color, cow, blurred the cow, softened it, more texture. And then this is another way of looking at it, but this was the final version.
Right, yeah. Nice. Well, thank you so much, Fran, for sharing that with us. I know that I got a lot out of that, especially as a fellow compositing artist. You've kind of given me some inspiration and also maybe removed the shackles of the idea that I have to have some dominant theme or concept running through all of my composites. So it's been a little bit liberating for me personally on that note.
I think it's important for both of us to remember that. So we have to sort of create our own new form of art.
Yeah, no, it's great. Wonderful conversation, and really glad to have had that.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great opportunity for me. You can look at more images at my recently redesigned website, which is simply franforman.com. and follow me on Facebook. I have a show coming up, a solo at the Pucker Gallery, which is on Newbury Street in Boston. It's a fine art gallery, and the opening is June the 4th. So if anyone is in New England, please stop by, say hi to me. And it's all new work, some of which you will see here on this show, but some of which you haven't seen yet. So I've been working over the past 4 months just completing that body of work for that show.
Cool. And then you also have a book that came out. Was it last year your book came out?
Yes, it's called Escape Artists, which you will see. It's published by Schiffer Books. It's about 190 pages, 96 color images, and poetry and essays. And I really loved working on it. It was also an opportunity for me to understand the connecting units that made my work kind of fit together in a way that I hadn't seen before. So the design of the book, which I did, was almost as much fun as actually creating the individual images.
I bet, and I'm sure that your background in graphic arts and graphic design
it came in handy. It came in handy. It did.
I'm sure it did. Yeah, cool. All right. Well, again, thank you so much. I will put links to your website and to the book in the show notes. And then you also occasionally teach workshops, and I assume that there's information on your website about that for people who are interested.
Yes, upcoming ones. I recently taught a workshop in Los Angeles. I'll probably return. We don't have dates set yet. And just check my website. It'll have updated information.
Great.
So,
cool.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye.
And thank you, everybody out there in internet land, for joining me here on TheFIX. Remember that you can also subscribe to the audio version of TheFIX on iTunes, and you can come to the website for the video version as well as an audio version. And you can find that at thisweekinphoto.com/TheFIX. I'm Seán Duggan. Thanks very much for watching. We'll catch you next week on TheFIX.